Kia ora koutou and welcome to our first thought leadership for our 2024. So the title of today's talk is Inclusionary Housing. Steph Lacey is going to introduce the talk in a minute, so I'm just going to jump in a little bit about the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. So ko Frida Wells toku ingoa, and my role is Managing Comms and Engagement for the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Leadership Committee, we're one of 6 joint committees around Aotearoa. We're a partnership of leaders in local government, central government, and iwi and mana whenua across the Wairarapa, Wellington, Horowhenua region to work collaboratively to address our cross-boundary challenges at a regional level and to oversee regional spatial planning, which is the future development strategy, and economic development. And our goal is to build a place where people can live, work and thrive. We're here to listen to Chris Glaudel today to speak about a housing issue. And I found some lovely words about what a home is. A home is more than a financial asset or a roof over our heads. It provides critical foundations for pretty much everything in life. It's deeply connected to agency, identity and connection. Home is where we care for children, elders, partners and ourselves. The right kind of home also provides us with a complex set of psychosocial benefits. Without further ado, I will quickly introduce Steph Lacey. So Steph is the project lead for our Regional Housing Action Plan. Steph is a principal advisor at the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. Steph works in the place-based strategy team, supporting the directors in Aotearoa and Wellington. And part of her work in Wellington involves working with the Wellington Regional Leadership Secretariat team to maintain the Regional Housing Action Plan network, including events like today's. And Steph's background is predominantly in social housing in the UK and New Zealand. So over to you, Steph.
Thank you, Frida, and hi everyone. I'm just really playing the role to introduce our speaker today. I'm really pleased that we've got this topic for a webinar. It's a subject quite close to my heart, and I'm looking forward to hearing Chris talk about his research and experiences around inclusionary zoning or affordable housing policy or whatever we might need to be calling it, because I think there are a number of labels out there. So today's talk is titled Inclusionary Housing, What It Is and Why Should We Take It Seriously? A Pathway Forward in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Chris Glaudel's from Community Housing Aotearoa, where he's the Deputy CEO, and he's going to talk about the what, the why and the how of inclusionary housing in New Zealand, and how it offers a pathway forward out, or how it could offer a pathway forward out of the country's housing crisis. Affordable, healthy homes are at the heart of strong communities, like clean water, like hospitals, transport. They're actually part of the essential infrastructure in the lives of our people. But there is a lack of affordable, healthy housing, and it's one of the biggest challenges we face. And we all face that quite differently in the agencies that we work in, but collectively it's quite a similar issue. Done well, inclusionary housing can be a powerful lever to address affordable housing shortages. And I hope that the conversation after today's presentation might draw on experiences from elsewhere, both in New Zealand but also abroad, because I think there's a number of different tools and options that are probably out there for consideration. So Chris, as I mentioned, is the Deputy CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa. He's got over 25 years of experience in community housing, which is actually the same as me too. So there you go, we have something in common, Chris, although quite similar, quite different backgrounds. And he's got core skills in housing finance, housing development, asset management and policy. As part of the team at Community Housing Aotearoa, he's responsible for the activities of Community Housing Solutions, its consulting subsidiary. They provide housing needs assessments, advice on housing strategy and policies, and other services to providers, local and central government, but with the aim of increasing the supply of affordable homes. Prior experience that Chris has in the US includes the development of more than 1,500 affordable ownership and rental homes in Central California. He was also responsible for the asset management of 115 properties, which comprised more than 5,000 units, all serving low-income households. His experience included advocating for and implementing inclusionary housing policies in several northern and central California cities. He relocated to Wellington in New Zealand in January 2012, and has actually been with Community Housing Aotearoa for 10.5 years now, since November 2013. So welcome, Chris. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation and in particular the discussion afterwards.
Kia ora koutou, ko Chris Glaudel toku ingoa. And thank you, Stephanie, for that Great introduction. I would have sent through a shorter bio if you knew it was all going to be used. And Frida and the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee, thank you for hosting this webinar. And welcome to everyone online and those of you here in the room. Looking forward to sharing some thoughts around inclusionary housing and having a robust discussion. Please note the slides are all available. Frida has those for distribution, along with the links to the various reports and studies and other things. So I'll be going rather quickly through this because you could spend days on inclusionary housing, and yeah, we've got an hour, and I want to make sure we have some time for some discussion along with this. So to start with, really, what is inclusionary housing? And to me, this picture really epitomizes it. It's permanently affordable retained homes. It's a planning tool which delivers affordable homes. To me, this photo encapsulates what it is. It's a home. It's something that's tangibly produced from a planning program. And that home is affordable and it's retained permanently for future benefit. And there's a lot of confusion around inclusionary. It can be a hard concept if you haven't seen or utilized the program before. And when you look into the literature, because it's used in so many different countries and places and implemented in different ways, it can be sometimes hard to contextualize as to how this would operate in your own community and how it would work within Aotearoa. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the research that we've done through Community Housing Aotearoa and our subsidiary Community Housing Solutions over the last several years. But our work in this space goes back as an organization over 10, 15 years, and me personally, as Stephanie pointed to, really about 25 years looking at inclusionary housing. And so I'll go over the three papers that we've done and hopefully demystify inclusionary housing a bit for you all. Talk about how it works well when it has good design parameters and principles. Talk about the current status of this in New Zealand and where it's been tried or where people are considering it, and why I believe it should be enabled through legislation. In terms of a definition, for folks that like those things, it's a planning tool that's commonly used internationally that requires or provides incentives for private developers to incorporate affordable housing into new developments. They're quite varied, and they produce homes of different sizes and typologies, and also for rent or for ownership. And we should take it seriously because it works. The evidence is clear. Inclusionary housing programs, when well designed and applied consistently, produce affordable homes. Now, they won't solve the housing challenges, all of the housing challenges we face, but they are a tool that can provide new homes and a supply of those homes on an ongoing basis. And it's important to understand what it's not. It's not a substitute for government investment into social housing, emergency housing, transitional housing. It's a complement to those investments from government. And we need more supply. When we're looking at the homes that are required, we need a lot more supply. But the evidence shows that supply alone doesn't guarantee affordability, and it especially does not incentivize ongoing or retained affordable housing. The private market, while it has a great role to play in providing housing, has not, cannot, and will not deliver truly affordable homes, nor substantively improve affordability without intervention. So this means policy responses like inclusionary housing are needed that are proportional to the need and magnitude of that need that we have currently in New Zealand. And if I do my job well today, you'll have a better understanding of why I hold that opinion and why our organization advocates for inclusionary housing. Very quickly, Community Housing Aotearoa, we're an incorporated society of housing organizations, a peak body. We work alongside the Te Matapihi Trust, which advocates for iwi and Maori housing interests. Our providers are across the country. About 85 of those provide homes. And then we also have partner members, including local authorities, planners, builders, and others that share the kaupapa. Whenever problems of housing and housing affordability come up, lots of questions arise. And, isn't it really, the planning and consenting, if just councils could do things quicker and faster, or lack of labor, the supply chain issues? Certainly COVID had huge impacts on the availability of materials and labor. And yes, those are all real issues. They all need to be addressed. But on their own, they won't resolve the affordability issues that we have. The real problem is affordability. And affordability is something that has been deteriorating for many years and is well documented. I won't go into the research and the documentation on that. I'm assuming everybody that's participating in this has an interest, already understands that. But this graph shows the median multiple. So the median home price and the median household income. And it on the graph, I've highlighted it. The number 3, usually 3, 3.5, maybe 4 is considered internationally an appropriate multiple for a well-functioning housing system. And you can say New Zealand was trucking along that way for quite some time, through the 70s, 80s, into the early 90s. And then things kind of got off track. And one of the worst median multiples in the world into the early 2020s. And while the graph goes down, if it were to be updated with the latest figures out, it would show another uptick that's happened over the last 6 to 12 months. And so really, this is what we're talking about today around inclusionary housing. It's the affordability of homes for households. And the great thing with inclusionary housing is it provides a counterbalance to current demand side incentives because it's a supply side solution. It delivers homes. And so on the demand side, we've got things like the accommodation supplement, first home grants and loans and other things that incentivize people to purchase. This incentivizes the delivery of affordable homes, which we think is very important to balance things out. And when we talk about affordability, really what is that? It's bandied about around a lot. And people use it for various purposes. But it really is the lens that you look through that's important. This home was quite affordable to the purchase, to the person who built it and who was able to hire Julia Morgan, a world-renowned architect who spent over a decade, I think probably closer to 20 years building it. But, we're not all publishing magnates like William Randolph Hearst. We all can't, buy a hilltop in San Simeon, California and bring art from around the world to adorn it. So really, what does it mean at the level within New Zealand and within a context? Fortunately, our friends at Local Government New Zealand and Benno Blaschke, who worked with us for some time around advocacy on inclusionary housing, presented these thoughts around housing affordability. And one of those is really looking at that higher level of a market, the top definition. What's going on within a larger market area, within a community, and housing affordability getting better or worse? The graph that I showed of the median multiple is an example of that. It went up, it dropped a little, so that's improving affordability. But at a household level, at that housing lens, affordability is related to what a household can afford. And internationally, that's considered to be about 30% of income. Obviously, as you go up the income bands, you're making a couple $100 million a year, spending 50 or 60 or percent of your income means you can still afford to travel, pay for clothes, healthcare, all those other normal family expenses. When you're on a very low income, that gets much more difficult. And as a reference point within Aotearoa, the income-related rent subsidy, the public housing, is at 25% of income. And so that recognizes those households on the very lowest incomes. The amount that they can afford to spend on their housing expenses is a bit lower. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the experience that New Zealand has in inclusionary housing. And really the Queenstown Lakes District Council has been at the forefront of this with their activities beginning in 2003 with Plan Change 24 that proposed mandatory requirements. That was challenged. It was settled out of court. There has not yet been a definitive ruling around the parameters of inclusionary housing programs, but it was clear the High Court said yes. Using the RMA to require housing contributions through an inclusionary program is allowable, but we don't know any of the guardrails around that. And that's why there's continued to be a lot of uncertainty. The Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, one of our members, has been the beneficiary of that program, and they've done some great work. Since 2007, when they were established, they've received $49 million of contributions through that program and used that and leveraged it into $92 million of net assets for that organization. They've completed 129 homes. They've got more than 100 in the pipeline. And that's the great part of inclusionary is it continues to build as long as there's development activity and housing growth in a community. So it ensures that continuing pipeline of adding more supply. There have been other examples of where we've kind of put our toe into the water on this. One of those was the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Act of 2013. And that did enable councils to require some mandatory or some include some affordable housing requirements along with the fast track consenting processes. Mixed bag, it worked well in Queenstown Lakes because they had an existing framework and a program. Other places, not as well, and the evidence and the research that's been completed kind of documents that, and those links are in the study. And then we've got other statements where we're talking about utilizing such tools. So the Urban Development Act of 2020, it enabled value capture, which it referred to as betterment, but it restricted its use solely to transport. Important to have transport infrastructure, but would have been nice to see it if you're talking about urban development to also include housing. The government policy statement on housing and urban development similarly identified a priority stated to ensure local government and central government agencies have the right funding tools available, including value capture tools and infrastructure pricing, and the right incentives to use them. Those haven't been enabled yet. We saw an opportunity through the Resource Management Act reforms and engaged extensively with government. Unfortunately, our efforts were unsuccessful in including that into the RMA reform bills, which we now may have another chance because those are being unwound. So I guess never take an initial setback as the end of the game. And we certainly take the long view of things at Community Housing Aotearoa. And so it's very timely that we're back in discussing this issue because a lot of local authorities would like to progress, but they've been inhibited because of the uncertainty. And that includes, Queenstown Lakes is now again pushing for mandatory inclusionary housing through their district plan change. Waipaw District is also proposing this. Others have walked up to the edge and paused and are looking for that certainty. And briefly going over the papers that we presented, the first one was released over 3 years ago, hard to believe. And it looked into the rapid decline of low to median value homes since the 1990s. It reviewed research and evidence on inclusionary housing programs and identified good design principles for inclusion in those. It's not nearly as well formatted and pretty as our last paper. So if you just look at one paper, it'd be the third one. But what we did find in that initial paper and document is that inclusionary housing provides homes meeting local needs. It produces things like the Toto apartments. Or enables developers to purchase into that. So Queenstown Lakes, off of that investment that came in over successive years that built their balance sheet, they were able to leverage that and to purchase apartments there in Queenstown in a new development. And the brilliant thing about inclusionary housing is we'll get into how you design and implement those, but it can meet different needs within a community and provide for different typologies, different household sizes, different specific needs of individuals who aren't being well served. And the evidence in housing research within New Zealand documents that not all households are being well served. We're not producing nearly enough 1 and 2 bedroom homes to meet changing demographic and household sizes. We're not producing nearly enough accessible homes to meet people's needs for accessibility, especially as our population ages. And we're certainly not providing culturally adequate homes. We're not providing homes that are intergenerationally appropriate or that meet the specific cultural needs of Maori and Pacific households, amongst many others. Inclusionary housing, when done well, can provide for all of those disparate needs and tailor that response to the individual communities. And so what would be produced in, say, Queenstown in terms of typology and household needs that are being addressed will differ from those of South Auckland or in Northland. And that's one of the great strengths of inclusionary housing, is that ability to be very different, but also one of the things that makes it difficult when you're first trying to understand what it is and how it operates, to really get a good grasp of it. The second paper explored the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act of 2008, referred to as AHETA. This was legislation that was passed that actually did enable local authorities to put in place mandatory inclusionary housing programs. And what we found in reviewing that is that, in general, its policy framework is still fit for purpose. It's largely applicable. It needs to be updated for current situation and other research, but it's a great starting point, a great launching point to look at legislation. Unfortunately, it was repealed in 2010 before anyone was able to advance any programs under it. That was due to a change of government at that time. We don't find any information in regards to why that decision was made to repeal. The evidence-based reasons why it wasn't a good idea, but it's gone. And so now we get to start over and continue to advocate for new policies. The third paper really gets into a lot more detail, and fundamentally, this paper answers or evaluates the why, and also answers the how, or our proposed how, of adopting inclusionary housing in Aotearoa. And we think why is because of the needs that we have, and we feel that inclusionary housing is an effective tool to address that. And we look at how local governments and through central government enablement can actually start to address the needs that have built up over time. One of the key arguments against inclusionary is that it will stop or reduce developments by making them financially infeasible. And again, the research and the evidence, both internationally and from Aotearoa specific studies and actual practice, is that it doesn't. And it also ignores the residual land valuation approach that's utilized in real estate development. I've been in many public forums and had developers tell me that no, it'll stop everything. It's not the way it works. Well, I spent over a decade building new homes. I know how developers approach land purchases and valuation. And you start with what your known costs are, and you have a certain amount remaining that you can pay for the land with. And that's how it works, and the evidence is there. And if you challenge that, go talk to Dr. Larry Murphy at Auckland University, who's an expert on that. We also talk about how land shocks impact on housing markets, and that's both through liberalization, loosening requirements, the approach that we've often taken in New Zealand, and it also talks about the imposition of requirements such as inclusionary housing, and that those land value shocks have direct impacts. And so when the Auckland Unitary Plan came in, and there was that enablement, when the MDRS was adopted and there was that enablement, it basically gifted about $100,000 per section in Auckland, based on the research in value to the owners of that existing property. And so if you had if you're already a homeowner, great. If you're already a landowner, great. If you weren't, it just makes it that much harder. And what we know also is that developers are not price makers, they're price takers. A new home into Wellington City isn't based on what it costs to build that home. It's based on all those other homes that exist in the market and the options that are available to purchase. And so valuations, when they're done, take into account what is the local market through actual sales transactions. And so if you're able to bring in at a lower price point through efficient building materials and methods, through other ways, and your cost to develop are lower, then you have a higher profit. And private developers have no incentive to charge an artificially lower price. It's not their role. This isn't a criticism of private developers. It's not what they're doing. They're in business to build homes and to make money. Good on them. At the same time, there's a lot of people within our communities that don't earn enough to afford those new homes at the inflated prices that we have. And so inclusionary housing then becomes a tool that when there is a value uplift through our planning mechanisms that enable developers to build new homes in a community, a portion of that is retained and utilized for community benefit and to meet documented, identified community needs. And the great part about it is it actually works, and it works everywhere. So we've got some great examples. England, the Section 106 that many people may be familiar with or have heard about, it produced 44,000 new homes in 2020. 44,000 in 2020. In South Australia, New South Wales, we often look across to Australia about what's going on there. And again, those two states have delivered over thousands of homes since they've had programs over the last decade or so. In the United States, where I have direct experience, something like 886 jurisdictions have adopted programs, and they've delivered over 170,000 homes. And so it does work. It does produce homes. In the picture on the left, I had the good fortune of being across to Australia over a year ago, and I visited this site, City West Housing. And it's one of the 20 developments that they've done, over 890 homes that they've delivered through the program there in Sydney. And when you say, but New Zealand's different, well, the picture on the right is Johannesburg. They adopted a program in 2019, first in Africa. And so if you can get areas as disparate as the United Kingdom, as South Africa, and across in Australia and other areas that can utilize this, there's no reason that we can't make it work in Aotearoa. But how would we do that? The paper that third paper goes into a series of explanations based on the evidence, reviewing AHITA and others about how you would do this. And one of the things that we identified early on is that there should be an exemption in place for land subject to Te Ture Whenua Act. That land that is held for the benefit of iwi and Maori and utilized to support those tribal members, we feel should be excluded. There may be some exceptional circumstances, and those would be worked through during the consultation process at a local level. But in general, you'll need to read this to get the depth of information, but we think primary legislation is required that would address each of the points shown here. You have a housing needs assessment, you develop a strategy based on the identified needs, you develop criteria for how homes will be allocated, both to who would deliver, typically through a not-for-profit, hopefully a registered community housing provider, but at least a not-for-profit organization to hold that value that's transferred across. And processes and mechanisms for the land transfer and for the retention mechanisms. And these should be set at a national level and utilized consistently. Every council shouldn't have to figure this out, hire their own lawyers to come up with things and then argue about whether it fits or not. Let's work it out nationally and enable communities to develop it quickly and easily and have consistency so that developers and all of their advisors that work across multiple local authority areas know what they're going to get in every area and how it will work. We should enable both inclusionary housing tied to new development, but also the linkage zoning, or when we put in infrastructure investment. The example that we use in the paper was around, I believe, Auckland Light Rail. Again, we'll need to find a new example as that has been unwound. But it's a good example of where major infrastructure developments raise land value along the corridor, and especially where the transit hubs are located. Obviously, Wellington has a lot of public transit infrastructure and may or may not have more in the future, but that would be something to keep in mind. And then finally, we should look at the consultation processes and requirements for monitoring and reviewing that would be consistent. We refer in the papers to the then Spatial Planning Act, which we felt had some good provisions. Again, we'll need to revisit how those would come into play. And then in secondary legislation is really going into more detail, and we think it should be in regulation or secondary because it takes a long time before you can often open up primary legislation and go back and amend an act after it's been adopted. And what we want is a learning environment. We want local authorities to adopt and implement and learn and provide feedback and to be able to make those adjustments based on evidence and do it in a timely fashion. And so we think going into the details of these specific components of exactly the processes that you would follow is best to be done through secondary legislation. We also spend quite a bit of time in that third paper on looking on the evidence of land supply and land markets. And we've benefited after the paper was done, I believe, with the report that was done in support of the Medium Density Residential Standards Bill, which had at the time bipartisan support to upzone and caused great angst amongst all the planners who had to drop everything they were previously working on to update district plans to comply with that. But since partners in PwC provided a cost-benefit analysis, and it really clarified the limitations of land use liberalization on affordability. And that report suggested that the impact of the MDRS would reduce the transfer of wealth over time by narrowing the gap between the rise in incomes and the rise in house prices. It would not provide affordability. It would narrow the gap that has been widening and reduce the transfer of wealth. So even that, touted to be affordability improving, yeah, but if you go back to that household lens, was it truly affordable? Was it delivering at levels that were affordable to households? It was never going to do that. So it was simply mitigating our current problems. And land markets and land supply, they don't neatly conform to economic theory. You know, it just works much longer than producing a new widget that anybody could buy in the market. It takes years to build, high barriers to entry, and the incentives aren't there to reduce costs. And frankly, I've never heard any of the major political parties saying, we want to do something to drive down the real cost of housing. And there's a good reason for that. It's because so much of New Zealand's wealth and so much household debt is tied up in housing. And so we need other tools to begin addressing that. And then in addition, land developers and speculators can manipulate markets. And England passed legislation that required local authorities to increase the amount of available land supply, similar to what we've done here. And the research a decade later showed that build-out times more than doubled from 2 years to 5 years. It also demonstrated that about a third of the land that was enabled was acquired by speculators, not by builders, not by developers who were actually going to progress it, but by financial investors who saw an opportunity to make money by acquiring property and holding it, and then drip feeding it into the market to maintain build out rates that maintained prices. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, well, it didn't achieve its end. Where you tie that land liberalization to inclusionary housing, you ensure that some of that benefit comes back to the community and you actually produce affordable homes. Here in Aotearoa, we've had the special housing areas. Recent research from Dr. Kay Saville-Smith under the Affordable Housing for Generations, Building Better Homes, Towns, and Cities research looked at side-by-side sites in Rolleston, one in SHA, the other not in SHA, developed at the same time. SHA was projected to produce about 1,350 dwellings. It produced 369. The non-SHA delivered over 1,000 homes. Of that 369 produced within the special housing area, about a third were resold over a 3-year period. And that brings us to really that issue around resales and around retention. One of the criticisms in poorly designed programs is that they don't retain the housing and that there's a windfall to the first occupant. And that's a real criticism of poorly designed inclusionary housing programs. So when that public benefit is captured and retained and held within a not-for-profit organization, within a community land trust or some similar entity for long-term benefit, it ensures that that flows over time. And so some more research from Dr. Saville-Smith on the build costs of an affordable home, a starter home. And this graph shows this home in Auckland in Otara Papatoetoe local board area. and what it cost in 2010 when it was built, around $295,000, and its valuation over time. And then the affordability. So when it was first built, 42% of the households could affordably purchase that. And a little over, a decade later, it went down to 21%. So half of the households in that same market area could afford that home. That's why we want strong retention mechanisms. So in summary, we need every tool available. The housing challenges in communities across Aotearoa are well known, and we need new tools. Inclusionary housing is proven, both internationally and locally. Local authorities want to see it. Local government New Zealand, in a remit in 2020, the members overwhelmingly supported asking central government to enable them to adopt inclusionary housing programs. Local communities have demonstrated strong support. So in Wellington, the assisted housing provisions receive strong public support. Community feedback on Queenstown Lake District Council's plan and other district plans around inclusionary housing have also demonstrated strong public support. And finally, for those that say, no, we shouldn't do this, then, if not this, then what? And if not now, when? Some additional links that'll be out there so you can look at what those local authorities have done, the actual economic feasibility analysis, the market studies, the proposals, and the submittals. So with that, thank you, and look forward to any questions people may have.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. That was really excellent talk, and I know that the Q&A is the rich part of the presentation. So it's really nice to get a bit more connection. So feel free to turn on your camera and just raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. And if people in the room would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, please.
Kia ora. Thanks, Chris. It was a really good presentation. Kia ora, I'm Angelique Jackson, CEO of Te Toi Mahana community housing provider in Poneke that took over from Wellington City Council in August last year. Approximately 1,800 homes, about 3,000 tenants. Just curious around, obviously talks with the new government are underway, and I'm sure will take time, and the May budget and things like that still to come. If central government didn't come to the party, whether this government or a future government, can councils such as what Queenstown Lakes have done do it on their own?
Yes, they can, but what we see is inevitably it will be challenged because the issues of law are unresolved. And while the High Court had previously ruled that it is allowable under the RMA to look at housing affordability, it never provided information around kind of what I've described as the guardrails, or what are those elements that you can do and how would you go about it. So Queenstown Lakes is progressing. Waipaw District Council has introduced a mandatory inclusionary housing provision in their draft district plan, but it doesn't serve us well to spend that amount of time and money on studies and lawyers and fighting when we have such a current crisis. So we think that it really does need to be clarified, frankly, one way or the other.
Hey, kia ora, everyone. And Chris as well, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Harry. I work at the Ministry for the Environment, and I'm based up in Auckland. I was wondering, you touched on what I thought was a very interesting and important point, and one that I often think about, which is kind of the paradox between both citizens and politicians kind of talking about wanting affordable housing, the logical consequence of which the kind of really inflated current house prices would have to drop or decrease or be pushed down in some way, and the really kind of fundamental tension that has when so many people have so much wealth and, to your point as well, debt, and basically so much riding on existing property prices, whether they own property, one property or multiple. And so I was just wondering if you had brought that up, but I was wondering if you had an answer to that problem, or like an approach to kind of mitigating that kind of fundamental tension between wanting at the same time housing affordability, but have so many people with so much vested interest in those inflated housing prices kind of being retained or even continually growing, as that's kind of a substitute for a more robust welfare state.
Thank you, Harry. I have ideas on everything, so that's not a problem. Yeah, and I have to agree. The worst thing we would want to see is for us to have a lot of homeowners who are so-called upside down on equity, who then owe more than they have in the U.S. Where I come from, it's not as bad because you can walk away, declare bankruptcy, the bank gets the house. In New Zealand, that debt follows you till the end of your life. And so within the New Zealand context, the consequences at a household level are extreme. And I don't think anybody really wants to see everything fall apart through a shock. At the same time, we've got people living on the streets. We've got people in hotels, families in hotels for a year or two. That's unacceptable. So inclusionary is one tool is needed. I think we need to look at, the T word, tax. The continuation of the preferential treatment of residential real estate as a financial investment versus a home incentivizes people to purchase homes for profit. Again, coming out of the US, hell, we have capital gains taxes on houses for rental property. I know because I still own mine in Sacramento because I had no idea I'd be here after 12 years. And so that's something I have to face in terms of how I approach that personal investment. But that's the same tax rate I would pay on other investments. And so we're incentivizing people to play Monopoly. And it's not working out very well for us. The other thing that we would want to see, and it comes back to my comment around land supply, it's absolutely necessary. We need to continue to build as many homes as we can, but we can't expect it in the short run to make it immediately affordable at that household level. But what we could see is if we're producing enough, is that the rise in prices that we've seen over time would slow or halt. And based on modeling that we've done, over a decade or so of historical wage growth, it would begin to narrow that gap and bring that median multiple down. It will never necessarily reach those on the lowest incomes, but it would help overall at the median level, that overall market affordability.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. Lynette, I see you've got your hand raised, please. Go for it.
Kia ora. Thank you, Chris. That was delightful and probably hopeful sense of being able to see that somebody is actually listening to some of the real challenges at the front line. So I'm Lynette Wharara, I'm our CEO for Hokianga Housing Resilience Collective, and it was wonderful to see that you've got some comparative stuff internationally, especially in some of those low socioeconomic areas, which I think we throw that around a little bit, but I'm thankful to see that some of that stuff has been brought to the front of the research that's been taking place. I'm just curious if there's actually a rural piece of work that's taking place for inclusionary housing. What does that look like? And especially one that could possibly capture Māori whenua or whenua Māori, and what that would look like for inclusionary housing on whenua Māori. The models that were and the approaches that were presented here today were exciting, especially because we all are getting a feel for the geopolitical changes that are going on at the moment. And while we can wait, we certainly know that we are waiting with some intentionality building up in the background. So yeah, if there is any research out there at the moment or a pilot that's addressing some of the whenua Māori exemptions that were highlighted, yeah, I'm keen to find out some of that information. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Lynette. And what I talked about around that exemption is that if this were to be enabled nationally within legislation, to have that as an exemption so that whenua Māori wouldn't be contributed to the local authority separately, but would be used for those beneficiaries. Now, I would need to go back and part of the research that we did identified, say in the US example, those 800 some odd programs, and we can also look to Canada and First Nations and how things have been applied there. That would probably give us some ideas of ways that we could look at whenua Māori and how it could support that. But what we do say is that through that housing needs assessment, is that when those are done, it should look at outcomes in a housing market area by household composition, household size, and age, and also the housing outcomes by ethnicity. because we know that in most areas, the housing outcomes from Maori, housing outcomes in areas with high Pacific populations are very poor for Maori and Pacific as compared for Pakeha. So that disparity needs to be directly addressed through the housing strategies that would be developed based on the needs assessment of the outcomes in a market area.
Thanks for that, Chris.
Thank you. Debbie, you've got a question.
Hi, I'm Debbie Leyland. I'm the coordinator for UCAN, United Community Action Network. With inclusion housing, I'm wondering, how do we make sure, or how would you make sure that people with enduring mental health illness are included, and making sure that they are being looked after and treated as anybody else, and to stop them ending up on the street committing suicide, and making our community safer for everybody, because these people don't have a voice.
Yeah, kia ora, Debbie. Yeah, and certainly again through that beginning step of a housing needs assessment and understanding who is not being served within a community, that should identify that where that is an issue, and we know it's an issue. Our member providers know that and try to support those households every day. And it does require a specific housing response and typology often that meets those needs. And so those would be things that would be identified. Because you now have that needs assessment, you can measure it. You now develop a housing strategy, and you set goals and outcomes, and then you can track that through the review and monitoring process if you're making progress over time. And if you're not, you have that opportunity to show up at local authority and say, why aren't we addressing this? Why is this number not changing as we've reviewed and updated our needs assessment?
Thank you.
I see we've got Sam. Please jump in, and then I've got a question from Steph.
Kia ora, Chris. I'm from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. You touched on in your presentation a concept of the land value uplift. And I'm just keen to hear you sort of expand on that, and if there's any case studies out there that sort of demonstrate how that has worked in the past, particularly from a developer's perspective, and obviously anything around how inclusionary housing can be done successfully where, development economics is challenging, for example, where the cost to build is often more expensive than the value of the property. So yeah, any thoughts on that? I'd appreciate it. And yeah, thanks so much for the presentation.
Yeah, kia ora, Sam. I'm guessing you might be one of the people charged with trying to figure out how to develop in Northland or the East Cape or other areas.
Yeah.
It is challenging. And again, inclusionary can't solve every issue. And those issues of low incomes, low valuations, yet high build costs is one of those areas that gets really tricky. And I don't envy you trying to solve that. But I think that's where what I said, it isn't a substitute for central government's role in ensuring that we're progressively realizing the right to housing, and that we're setting up a housing system which enables all to be well housed. Now, in terms of studies and things around value shocks, yeah, and you'll see those references in the paper. And so I would suggest you take a look at, well, the MDRS talks a bit about it. There's a great study out of Auckland around the unitary plan. I think it was done by Remu, that really goes into the impacts of what happened with the Auckland unitary plan and value uplift. And other work by Dr. Larry Murphy and Dr. Michael Ream at Auckland University, amongst others, that talk specifically around the development economics. And, I preface saying I'm not an economist. I can say the words elasticity of supply and inelasticity, but, beyond that, I glaze over on some of that stuff myself.
Got it.
There's a question from Steph in the chat. Chris, I'd be keen to hear more detail about the importance of flexibility and negotiation in making inclusionary housing / Section 106 type approaches work. So not just IRRS or public housing, but affordable options across the piece, being able to form part of an agreement. Also, the options for on-off site provision of affordable housing. I know Queenstown had some success in negotiating their allocation at a more suitable location than where a particular development was taking place. I should have got you to read that, Steph.
Thanks, Frida.
Kia ora. Both excellent questions. I'll start with the last one, the on-off site provisions. I feel those should only be allowed at the discretion of the council, and many reasons for that. But part of the the benefit that comes with inclusionary housing is that housing is built, it's contiguous with and part of developing communities. And so it provides that additional mix of both incomes and typologies in new growth areas where that's occurring, rather than sectioning it off and placing it somewhere else and creating economic segregation or typology segregation. In terms of the flexibility around negotiations, the evidence shows that mandatory inclusionary housing applied across an entire market area work best, and that when you have flexibility in negotiations, and Section 106 does rely upon that, and one of its shortcomings identified is the ability for different developers to more successfully argue for lower contribution rates than others. Sometimes, yes, there are some unique situations where it does make sense for offsite provision versus onsite, and that can be related again to identified needs in a population, and maybe there's an identified need to serve retirees and people with accessibility needs, and so you wouldn't want to put something in a hilly area, but there may be a nice site closer to GP services and banking and other community services that would be more appropriate. And again, at the discretion of a local authority, those decisions should be retained within it. But in general, on-site and in general mandatory versus requiring negotiations. It also then makes the whole process work faster and lessens the back and forth and the burden on planning staff to have to wade through those negotiations.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
It's 1 o'clock. We've probably got time for one last question. Stephen Cross, would you like to jump in?
Kia ora koutou. It's actually not Stephen, it's Jason Holland here. We've got a wee team in Kapiti watching, and thank you very much for the presentation. Chris, just picking up on a point you made about inclusionary zoning probably works best if it's applied across a market. In Wellington, that market spans a number of territorial areas, and I guess there's some fear perhaps amongst TAs that if one of us was to go ahead and do inclusionary zoning, that we're basically going to find developers going, we'll bugger you, we'll go over to that district and we'll do our development on the cheap over there. And it kind of leads me to ask, I'm not sure whether anybody at Greater Wellington is there that could answer this, but the regional policy statement could play a bit of a role in directing TAs if they were all agreeing. And just wonder whether that had ever come up in the Wellington context.
For myself, I think there's been some discussion around inclusionary, certainly among, within various local authorities. The market area issue is a big one, and in the paper we do talk about that. And at the time, again, we were referring to the spatial planning bill and its requirement to plan at a larger than TA level, recognizing that housing markets don't respect political boundaries or local authority boundaries. So extremely important. My experience in California, we started and successfully implemented a program within the city of Sacramento. And the adjacent local authority, the county of Sacramento, followed along several years later. And it wasn't ideal because if you look at it on a map, they were intertwined. And so it can lead to unintended consequences and shifting development from one area to another. So it is important to have those discussions and approach it regionally, or else you can have that unintended consequence of pushing development to other areas. I can't speak on behalf of the regional council about what may or may not be under discussion now, and Frida's shaking her head that she's not the one to respond to that. But I think it would be something that can come up at the Regional Housing Action Plan level as a discussion point. I know it's on the agenda for the meeting that was rescheduled to talk about some of this, so I'll go ahead and just add that to the agenda.
Thank you.
We've reached 1 o'clock, so yeah, just a huge thank you to you, Chris. That was a very rich presentation, well researched, and great interest. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Thank you.